Show me the money. I love the title for this because it's
Because
not,
you thought of it, Michelle.
no, I didn't think of it. I picked it. Um, I use AI to generate our panel titles. If you liked the titles and you thought they
Is
were
this a confession?
catchy,
Is this a big reveal?
this is a big reveal, but I don't think we often tie climate disclosures to show me the money. And I wanted to see, like, when I said disclosures, how many people were like scrunching their like, eyes, because it is definitely one of those things where no one's really thinking that it's a fun thing to do. So let's dive into the conversation today. So a lot has happened since January 2025, Ulysses.
Something, what?
Something happened in January. A
Yeah.
lot has changed. What is the state of climate in the US currently?
Wow, that's a topic. I feel like we're getting
Please take the next 15 minutes on this one.
medicine in this session. I mean, to be blessed with living in interesting times, I think that is certainly the case. I think when JFK used that expression, he called it a curse. So it's a blessing and a curse. I think we do live in interesting times, I think, when it comes to climate policy and the development of law and regulation in the US. I'm sure everyone in this room is well familiar with the dramatic changes that the current administration, the new administration, is implementing on US policy, everything from withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement and the UNFCCC framework agreements, eliminating emissions disclosure requirements for the power sector, massive scale of greenhouse gas emissions coming out of the power sector. We will not be seeing disclosure coming from there as we have in the past. Withdrawing something called the endangerment finding, which people don't widely know what that is, but it's incredibly important. It is a scientific and legal finding that is the basis for the regulation that we have in the Clean Air Act and sort of greenhouse gas emissions coming from vehicles. There is a movement in the current administration to withdraw that finding, which could render it sort of like a house of cards where a lot of the regulation starts to collapse around it. Inflation Reduction Act, you name it. There is a whole lot of change happening, I think, coming out of the administration. Probably most relevant for this conversation today, because we are talking about disclosure, and we're going to talk about California's climate disclosure laws, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates the U.S. financial markets, had its own greenhouse gas emission disclosure law that was put forward in the previous administration under Joe Biden that is being also backtracked, I think, from the current administration. So a lot happening at the federal level, but it's really important, I think, to recognize that in the US, the federal government isn't the only sort of force making the weather, so to speak, around climate. There is a huge amount of activity happening at the state level. I would say at the state level, there's sort of states that are cutting one way and states that are cutting the other. So the patchwork of law and regulation and policy in this area is incredibly challenging. And a lot of what I spend my time doing as a lawyer is advising big corporations and private equity firms and asset managers and banks to how to navigate those issues. But just to sort of tick off a couple, we'll talk about California, the disclosure laws, but everything from the carbon markets and cap and trade, I think was renewed in California very, very recently. That's quite exciting. Emissions reduction commitments and net zero commitments. New York and other states are really pushing hard on that. There is a lot of work happening in the private sector. I don't know about you all, but I've spent the last couple of days at various climate-related, week-related events, and I really came in this week thinking, like, are the rooms going to be half empty? Who's going to be turning up this year? And I would say my experience so far is that people are present, they're here, they're engaged, and I think a driving sort of concern in the folks that I work with is, how do you recognize the new reality, the change policy? How do you sort of backtrack a little bit, take that in, and recalibrate and find the way forward? So I think there is a lot of work being done in the private sector, in the business community, moving climate forward. And then I guess the last couple things I would just say is that, yes, Europe and others are having their own sort of efforts to sort of recalibrate and rethink some of these regulations that had been quite ambitious. But I think the rest of the world really is moving forward with their Paris commitments, even if they're, maybe more delayed than they might ideally be. And wow, I'm taking up way too much time. I'm sorry. I will be much more pithy next. Is this like the host prerogative?
Next year.
All right. And just to say that, we will see what happens. I mean, there's something about politics in this country where it is a pendulum that swings dramatically from one side to the other. The changes that we're seeing now, how many of them are necessarily going to remain in 4 or 5 or 10 years down the road? So I think there's a lot to be said about the change that's happening, but there's also a lot of reason to be somewhat cautiously optimistic about what the future holds. Thank you, and sorry for the long-windedness.
You may now all go home.
That was a great kind of setting the stage, Ulysses. There's a lot of change going on in the US, but at the state level, there's also a lot of positive change happening. So let's talk about one of those. California is rolling out 2 new regulations in 2026. Can you walk us through them, Adriel?
Yeah, so super simple. There's 2 laws that Governor Newsom signed 2 years ago. One's called SB 253, the other one's called SB 261. What I find super interesting about events like this is in my world, all anyone talks about is 253, 261, 253, 261, all day long, 253, 261. You show up in a room like this and everyone's talking about pants made out of kelp, and like no one's ever heard of 261. So I think that's awesome. So let me tell you all about it. SB 253, very simple law, says any company with over $1 billion in revenue that is headquartered in the United States but does its business in California has to start reporting on carbon emissions. By June 30th of next year, scope 1 and 2, and by the following year, probably, maybe, we'll see, scope 3. SB 261, which is the one I think is very interesting, requires companies with over $500 million in revenue, headquartered in the United States, doing business in California, to publish a climate-related financial risk report by January 1st of this year, which is, I think, 98 days. If you go on beehiveclimate.com, there's a very douchey countdown to January 1st to keep the pressure on. And so what that law requires is for you to do 2 assessments. One, a physical risk assessment. So what is your company's exposure to natural disasters today and in the future? And 2, a transition risk assessment, which is what risks or opportunities exist to your business in an economy impacted by climate change, and then write a big, long, fancy report. And that's due, check your watches, like 97.5 days now.
You're always really good at explaining complex topics, Adriel, so thank you for that. Can you break SB 261 down? Explain it in layman's terms, and what are some real-life examples of climate risks and what companies can do to actually mitigate them?
Yeah, so I actually want to touch on something Ulysses said around regulations, around pullback, and around the pendulum. Where we were 2 years ago was maybe too far to one side. Every small business needs to report on its emissions. Climate change is every pizzeria's problem and every florist's problem and Microsoft's problem, and everyone needs to buy offices and everyone needs to be carbon neutral. And we went very far to that side. And maybe there's some truth to that. There's also truth that most companies, you're not going to convince them that this is their problem, and they're going to be frustrated and see this as a big distraction. Perhaps right now we're going far to the other way. But what I find interesting about this SB 261 regulation is that when regulation is done well, what it is doing is making people or companies eat their vegetables. Which means, mostly, you don't want to eat your vegetable. My daughter likes chicken nuggets. Every once in a while, we cut up a piece of broccoli in the shape of a chicken and we trick her. And that's what regulation is. Like, maybe in a couple years, she'll do it anyway, but right now, we get her to eat her vegetables. And I think that's what's cool about a law like SB 261. All we're saying, all this law is saying, is natural disasters suck, and companies lose money when they happen. For example, you could take some very simple examples where I know a very large healthcare company that does blood work, make billions of dollars in revenue. They had warehouses and labs all over the LA area that burned down during the fires. And the fires were so devastating to their business, they fully pulled out of the California market. Huge problem. Apolitical. Wildfires suck, you lose money. Also happens in software businesses. They're a large software company that does like background checks, and every time there's a natural disaster in a place where they have business and a florist goes under and can't hire for the next 3 months, or a pizza shop is not going to hire delivery drivers because they got to rebuild after a hurricane, that company loses a significant amount of money. And their CFO runs around trying to figure out how much money. And all this law is saying is figure out how much money you lose when a natural disaster happens, figure out if that might go up or down over time, and tell your investors that. And if it's not a big number, great, it's not a big number. And if it is a big number, we should probably do something about it.
Great. You gave me some real life examples. Your employees are sometimes at risk as well. we don't have this in the questions, but I think it's helpful for people to know what Beehive does.
Yeah, so Beehive does what's called enterprise climate risk management software, which means those three things you have to do to comply with this law: run a physical risk assessment, a transition risk assessment, and write this report. Can normally be a 3 to 6 month consulting engagement, which costs you a lot of money, but Beehive uses software and AI to turn that process into an hour. And we give you this, and our customers are DocuSign and Asana and Valvoline and Unified Women's Healthcare, a lot of companies you guys probably interact with. And they basically do the assessment very quickly using AI, get their report written very quickly. Then they can turn their attention to actually doing some risk management around these disclosures, and that's the next phase of work.
Awesome. So I'm going to come back to Ulysses. Looking ahead, are we going to see decentralized climate legislation mandated at the state level? And what role can the federal government play? When we were chatting about this panel, one of the original battery laws where, battery return schemes, we all use disposable batteries, but like now we still don't really even know what to do with them because it depends on where you live and, what borough you're in. And the laws that were established early on ended up being at the state level, and every state had something different, which made it really difficult for manufacturers to standardize, and they were discouraged from doing something. So, we're seeing some power back to the state level, but actually to streamline and really make this easy, the federal laws play a really important role. So I'm curious on your opinion on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, room for state law innovation and development, and that's part of the way that this country has been set up. It's a federal government where you have the government at the federal level and at the state level all having the ability to regulate in certain areas, and there's preemption type issues where if the federal government regulates, then the states have to back off. But one of the sort of fundamental principles of the way law happens here is that the states are kind of like incubators of new ideas and innovation. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. It does mean that you do end up sometimes with situations where it's a crazy quilt patchwork of inconsistent laws and tension there. I think in the particular area that we're focusing on when we talk about the California laws that Adriel just walked us through, there are a lot of sort of common ancestors to the laws, the disclosure laws. Europe has what's called the CSRD, TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, is sort of an originator of disclosure here. And a lot of these different laws are kind of based on those forms, and even in the states now with New York and Illinois and Michigan, like there's a handful of states that haven't gone as far yet as California has. They don't have the laws on the books, but they are proposed laws, and they're extremely similar. So, there are ways that are happening where you sort of deal with the kind of friction between, laws in different sort of areas. And I think we'll see more of that. And especially, given an environment where the federal government is rowing so dramatically in the other direction, it's a deregulatory mission. That's what Trump campaigned on. That's what he got elected to do, and that is what he's doing. I think there is, the space for the states to really step in there. But for sure, I don't know if any of you listened to the speech at the UN today from the president. There really is a need at some point down the road for the federal government to step into this space and take leadership. Again, I hope, and we'll see where that goes. I don't think it's inconsistent, though, to have a federal government right now sort of being quiet while the states kind of move things forward.
Okay. Adriel, anything you want to add on the theory of change here?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say Shana Tova to those who celebrate. Should be said. Second of all, on the theory of change, it's kind of what I said earlier. Laws force you to do good laws, and there's all kinds. Some of them should go away, especially the speeding tickets all over New York. Whoever's in charge of that, make them go away. I'm not going to drive slower. But the theory of change here is that if you ask companies a simple question, don't talk about climate change necessarily, don't talk about emissions necessarily. Well, some of these laws do, but 261 does not. Don't talk about how we all need to kumbaya and save the planet. Don't talk about the fish or the polar bears. Say, do wildfires suck for you? And do hurricanes? And do tornadoes? And if the answer is no, and you actually did some work to decide that the answer is no, we should leave it at that. I am not here to convince you that the answer needs to be yes for everybody. And I'm also not here to convince you that you, the florist, need to do anything about it. Or you, the software company who is based, lucky you, in Canada and isn't really impacted by these things, needs to do anything about it. But if you do this work and you say, you know what? Turns out I lose like $15 million a year because of natural disasters. Turns out like, it's a big problem. My employees get hurt and they have to evacuate, or last year some people tragically died, or my customers went out of business and that cost me a lot of money, or my data center went down for an hour and that cost a legal issue, then I got sued for that. If any of that is true, and the law doesn't make you do anything about it, but all of a sudden you will say, holy shit, what am I doing about it? I think that's the theory of change that this law is pushing forward, is to say, if we can just make companies answer the question, do these things suck for you? Then they will begin to adapt. They will begin to invest in resilience on their own merit, because they're going to say, I don't want to lose $20 million next year. Maybe I'll invest $1 million and save 10. And that'll create the resilience in the communities and the companies and in the economies that I think we're all looking for here.
Awesome. Thank you, Ulysses, and thank you, Adriel.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks.